The night was eerily still in a quiet Austin neighborhood when the wail of police sirens shattered the silence. The red and blue lights reflected off the windows of neatly trimmed homes, casting fleeting shadows that danced ominously in the dark. Inside one house, an operator on the other end of a 911 call tried to steady their voice as a man spoke calmly, almost too calmly. "I killed them both," Ethan Carter confessed. His voice was devoid of panic, chilling in its resignation. "I couldn't let them destroy everything we built together." Those words, spoken with a haunting clarity, set off a chain of events that would shock the entire city of Austin. Ethan, a respected contractor, known for his strong work ethic and dedication to his wife, had always been the kind of man people admired. His marriage to Laura, a creative and outgoing graphic designer, seemed the picture of stability to anyone on the outside looking in. But beneath the surface of their life together, tensions had been simmering for months, unnoticed by even their closest friends. Ethan's long hours at work, while meant to secure their future, had created an emotional chasm. Laura's growing loneliness, meanwhile, left her vulnerable to someone who could offer her the attention she craved. That someone was Jason Miller, a charming and confident marketing consultant she'd met at a downtown networking event. Their connection had started innocently enough, but as Laura's dissatisfaction at home grew, so did her bond with Jason. Late-night texts turned into clandestine meetings, and the affair deepened until it was no longer something that could be ignored. For Ethan, the signs were subtle at first: a locked phone, a sudden need for personal space, a new distance in their conversations. But as suspicions crept into his mind, they began to consume him. Desperate for answers, he took measures to uncover the truth, his every discovery pushing him closer to an emotional edge. The 911 call and the horrific aftermath would become the talk of Austin. What could drive a man like Ethan to commit such a brutal act? And how had a seemingly ordinary life unraveled so completely? The chilling confession marked the beginning of an investigation into betrayal, anger, and the catastrophic choices made in the heat of passion. Ethan Carter was the kind of man who built his life on discipline and dependability. A successful contractor in Austin, Texas, he spent his days immersed in blueprints and deadlines, often working late into the evening to ensure every project met his impeccable standards. Ethan believed his dedication was a reflection of his love for Laura, his wife of 10 years. To him, the long hours and physical exhaustion were a small price to pay for their shared dreams, a future free from financial stress, filled with travel and the possibility of starting a family. Laura Carter, on the other hand, lived a quieter existence. As a freelance graphic designer, she worked from their home, a charming 2-bedroom house nestled in a tree-lined neighborhood just outside downtown Austin. She spent her days in solitude, balancing client deadlines with the occasional break to water the garden or sip coffee on the porch. But over time, that solitude began to feel oppressive. Ethan's absence weighed on her, and the house, once filled with warmth and laughter, started to feel more like a gilded cage. The loneliness crept in slowly, disguised as restlessness. Laura tried to combat it at first, inviting friends over, taking up hobbies, and even suggesting date nights to Ethan, which he often had to postpone due to work. As weeks turned into months, her yearning for connection deepened. She missed the easy conversations, the shared laughter, and the feeling of being truly seen. It was during one of those restless evenings that Laura decided to attend a networking event in downtown Austin. Held at a trendy rooftop bar with panoramic views of the city skyline, the event promised professional opportunities and a chance to break the monotony of her days. That's where she met Jason Miller. Jason was everything Ethan wasn't: spontaneous, charming, and effortlessly confident. As a marketing consultant, he thrived in social settings, commanding attention with his quick wit and easy smile. When he approached Laura, she felt an instant spark, a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. Their conversation flowed naturally, transitioning from work to personal anecdotes. By the end of the night, Jason had slipped her his number, his parting words lingering in her mind. "You're too interesting to stay cooped up all the time." What started as occasional texts about work quickly evolved into something more intimate. Jason's messages were flirty, filled with compliments that reignited a part of Laura she thought had been buried beneath years of routine. Their exchanges became a nightly ritual, each message pulling her further into a world she knew she shouldn't enter. Soon, their conversations extended beyond texts to secret lunches and late-night coffee runs. Meanwhile, Ethan began to notice changes in Laura. Her once open demeanor turned guarded. She would step out of the room to take calls or lock her phone the moment he walked in. There were unexplained absences, grocery runs that took hours, meetings with clients that seemed unusually frequent. Most concerning of all was the emotional distance. Laura, who once greeted Ethan with a warm smile and endless questions about his day, now seemed preoccupied, her mind elsewhere, even when they shared the same space. At first, Ethan brushed it off, attributing her behavior to the natural ebb and flow of marriage. But as the signs became harder to ignore, unease began to take root. It wasn't just the locked phone or the vague explanations. It was the way she avoided his touch, the way her laughter felt forced when they watched movies together. Ethan's instincts told him something was wrong, but his mind refused to entertain the possibility of betrayal. One evening, as Laura sat across the living room texting, Ethan broke the silence. "Who's that?" he asked casually, trying to mask the tension in his voice. "Just a client," Laura replied, barely looking up. The exchange left Ethan more unsettled than reassured. It was unlike Laura to be so evasive. That night, as she slept beside him, Ethan lay awake, staring at the ceiling. His mind raced with questions he didn't want answers to. Who was she texting at this hour? Why had she grown so distant? At work, Ethan found himself distracted. He confided in his colleague and friend, Mark, about the changes he'd noticed in Laura. Mark, a veteran of a bitter divorce, warned him to trust his instincts. "People don't change for no reason," he said bluntly. Determined to uncover the truth, Ethan began paying closer attention. He checked phone records, noting unfamiliar numbers that appeared repeatedly. He observed her patterns, noticing how she seemed particularly lively after certain outings. As much as he tried to convince himself that he was overthinking, the evidence of Laura's emotional distance was undeniable. Unbeknownst to Ethan, Laura's relationship with Jason had reached a tipping point. Their meetings had grown more frequent, their conversations more intimate. Jason, emboldened by Laura's vulnerability, began planting seeds of doubt about Ethan. "If he really cared, he'd be here for you," Jason told her one evening over drinks. Those words echoed in Laura's mind, fueling her justification for the path she was treading. The lives of Ethan, Laura, and Jason were now intertwined in a web of secrecy and lies, each decision pulling them closer to the brink. Ethan's suspicions, Laura's guilt, and Jason's manipulation were on a collision course, set to unravel in the most devastating way possible. Ethan Carter was never one to act impulsively, but the mounting evidence of Laura's betrayal had pushed him into unfamiliar territory. His love for her, once unwavering, was now laced with suspicion and hurt. Determined to uncover the truth, Ethan took steps he never imagined he'd resort to. Late one night, while Laura was asleep, he carefully placed a small recording device behind the bookshelf in their living room, a spot where she often took her calls. He also installed a GPS tracker on her car, rationalizing that the truth, no matter how painful, was better than the torment of uncertainty. In the days that followed, Ethan's suspicions were confirmed in ways he had both feared and dreaded. One evening, as he reviewed the audio recordings, he heard Laura's voice, low and conspiratorial. "I can't wait for this weekend, Jason. Just you and me. No distractions." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. The GPS tracker painted an equally damning picture. While Ethan was at work, Laura's car frequently parked outside Jason's apartment in downtown Austin or near high-end restaurants and event venues. These discoveries, though validating his fears, only deepened his emotional turmoil. At the same time, Ethan couldn't escape the memories of what they once had. Flashbacks of happier times consumed him. Lazy Sunday mornings spent laughing over pancakes, the honeymoon in the hill country, and the late-night conversations that had once made him feel invincible. These memories, once a source of comfort, now served as cruel reminders of how far they had fallen. Ethan's mental state began to unravel. He became withdrawn at work, his usually meticulous nature giving way to careless mistakes. His colleagues noticed the change, but he deflected their concerns, citing stress. At home, he avoided confronting Laura directly, instead watching her from a distance, trying to make sense of her actions. Laura, meanwhile, had grown bolder in her affair. What started as stolen moments with Jason had evolved into entire weekends spent together. They frequented Austin's trendiest spots, romantic rooftop bars with city views, dimly lit jazz clubs, and upscale bistros tucked away in downtown streets. To outsiders, they appeared as a carefree couple, sharing laughs and stolen kisses, unaware or unconcerned that their relationship was built on deception. Jason, ever the charmer, had begun planting seeds of doubt in Laura's mind about Ethan. "He's always working, always distracted," Jason would say. "You deserve someone who puts you first." Laura, vulnerable and starved for attention, found solace in his words. Over time, Jason's influence grew, and he began encouraging Laura to leave Ethan entirely. "You don't need to feel guilty," Jason told her one evening, over dinner at a cozy Italian restaurant. "You're not happy, and he's not giving you what you need. Life's too short to settle for less." Though Laura still hesitated, Jason's confidence and unwavering attention had a magnetic pull. She started imagining a life with him, free from the monotony and isolation she felt in her marriage. But deep down, guilt gnawed at her, a faint whisper reminding her of the vows she had taken and the man she was betraying. For Ethan, each piece of evidence became another dagger to his heart. One evening, he sat alone in their living room, listening to Laura laugh on a recorded call with Jason. Her laughter, once his favorite sound, now felt like a cruel mockery. He clutched the recording device in his hand, his knuckles white with tension. Driven to obsession, Ethan began following Laura. One Saturday, he watched from a distance as she and Jason strolled through Zilker Park. sharing a picnic under the shade of a sprawling oak tree. They looked so at ease, so content, that Ethan felt an almost out-of-body experience, like he was watching someone else's life fall apart. The emotional toll became unbearable. Ethan started losing sleep, his mind racing with questions he couldn't answer. Was it something he had done? Had he worked too much, neglected her needs? These thoughts swirled endlessly, feeding his growing sense of inadequacy and betrayal. Back at home, Laura continued to act as though nothing was amiss, but Ethan could see through the facade. Her phone was always within reach, her smile forced when they were together. Ethan, in turn, became a shadow of his former self, distant, distracted, and consumed by the weight of his discoveries. Despite everything, Ethan couldn't bring himself to confront Laura directly. Part of him clung to the hope that she would come to her senses, that the woman he loved would recognize the damage she was causing. But as the evidence mounted, hope gave way to anger, and anger to a simmering resolve. The turning point came when Ethan overheard Laura on another call with Jason, this time discussing plans to attend an exclusive gala downtown. She described the dress she would wear, her excitement palpable. For Ethan, it was the final straw. "I gave her everything," he muttered to himself, his voice low and trembling. "And this is how she repays me?" As the weekend approached, Ethan began making plans of his own. The anguish that had consumed him for weeks now transformed into something darker. He wasn't sure what he was going to do, but one thing was certain. He couldn't let things continue as they were. Ethan's investigation, once a desperate attempt to uncover the truth, had become the catalyst for a storm that no one would see coming. In the shadowy streets of Austin, where secrets thrived and betrayal festered, Ethan's world was hurtling towards an irreversible collision. The weekend began like any other, but Ethan Carter was anything but ordinary that day. His mind, now a battlefield of rage and heartbreak, had become fixated on a single goal: confrontation. Laura and Jason's plans to meet at a private rental house near Lake Travis were no longer a secret. Ethan had overheard every detail during one of her careless phone calls. This was his moment of reckoning. Lake Travis, a serene haven just outside Austin, was known for its picturesque sunsets and tranquil waters. That night, however, it would become the backdrop for a tragedy. Ethan prepared meticulously. He retrieved the gun from his bedside drawer, a weapon he had purchased years ago for home protection, but never thought he'd use. As he loaded the bullets into the chamber, his hands trembled, not with fear, but with the weight of his own intent. "She betrayed me," he muttered to himself, as if trying to justify the storm brewing within him. He drove in silence, the hum of his truck's engine blending with the rhythmic pounding of his heart. The route to Lake Travis was familiar, but this time, the serene landscape felt hauntingly foreign. Ethan's mind raced with memories. Laura laughing in the kitchen, her face illuminated by the soft glow of their home. The way she used to kiss him goodbye before work. Those memories, once cherished, now felt like ghosts of a life that no longer existed. As he approached the rental house, Ethan parked his truck a short distance away, ensuring he wouldn't be seen. The house stood secluded, surrounded by tall trees and bathed in the dim glow of outdoor string lights. Jason's sleek sports car was already parked in the driveway, a sight that made Ethan's blood boil. He watched from the shadows as Laura stepped out of her car, her laughter carrying through the still night air. Jason greeted her with a warm embrace, And for a moment, they stood there, oblivious to the eyes burning with fury just feet away. Ethan couldn't take it anymore. He stepped out of the shadows, his presence startling them. "Laura!" he called, his voice sharp and filled with anguish. Laura froze, her eyes widening in shock as she saw her husband standing there. Jason instinctively stepped forward, shielding her slightly. "Ethan, what are you doing here?" Laura stammered, her voice laced with fear and guilt. "What am I doing here?" Ethan repeated, his voice rising. "What are you doing here, Laura? With him?" He pointed at Jason, his hand trembling. Jason, attempting to maintain a calm demeanor, spoke up. "Ethan, listen, this isn't what you think. Don't you dare!" Ethan cut him off, his voice shaking with rage. "Don't you dare try to explain this away. I've seen it all. I've heard it all." Laura stepped forward, her hands raised as if to calm him. "Ethan, I didn't mean for it to happen like this. I was lonely. You were always gone, always working." "Don't you put this on me," Ethan roared. "I worked for us. Everything I did was for you. And this is how you repay me?" Tears streamed down Laura's face, but Ethan wasn't moved. He turned his attention to Jason, his voice cold and menacing. "And you? What kind of man inserts himself into someone else's marriage? Do you even understand what you've done?" Jason, sensing the danger, raised his hands defensively. "Look, man, I get it. You're hurt. Let's just talk this out." Ethan reached for the gun tucked into his waistband, pulling it out with a shaky hand. "There's nothing left to talk about," he said, his voice eerily calm. Laura screamed, stepping in front of Jason. "Ethan, no! Please, put the gun down." But Ethan was beyond reason. "You destroyed everything," he said, his voice breaking. "Everything we built, everything I thought we had. And for what? For him?" The argument escalated, voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony of anger, fear, and desperation. Jason tried to step forward, but Ethan raised the gun higher. "Don't!" Ethan barked. "Don't come any closer." In the tense silence that followed, the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the distant chirping of crickets. Ethan's mind was a whirlwind of emotions: rage, sorrow, betrayal, and an overwhelming sense of loss. And then, in a single, devastating moment, the silence was shattered. A gunshot rang out, echoing across the still waters of Lake Travis. Jason fell first, clutching his chest as he collapsed onto the driveway. Laura's scream pierced the night, but it was cut short by a second shot. She crumpled to the ground, her eyes wide with shock as she took her final breath. Ethan stood there, the gun still raised, his chest heaving as he stared at the lifeless bodies before him. The gravity of what he had done began to sink in, but there was no going back now. He dropped the gun, its metallic clatter breaking the heavy silence. Slowly, he pulled out his phone and dialed 911. When the operator answered, Ethan's voice was eerily calm. "I killed them both," he said. "I couldn't let them destroy everything we built together." As the sound of approaching sirens grew louder, Ethan sat down on the steps of the rental house, his head in his hands. The man who had entered the night consumed by rage now sat alone, surrounded by the wreckage of his life. The night was still and quiet when Ethan hung up the phone after his chilling confession to the 911 operator. The gravity of his actions settled over him like a suffocating fog, but he didn't flinch. He made no move to run or hide. Instead, he remained seated on the steps of the rental house, his hands loosely clasped between his knees. The flashing red and blue lights of the approaching police vehicles soon pierced the darkness. Their arrival was swift, but to Ethan, time seemed to stretch endlessly in the moments between his call and the screeching tires of the squad cars. Officers stepped out cautiously, their hands hovering over their holstered weapons, assessing the man who had just confessed to a double homicide. "Ethan Carter," one officer called out, his voice firm yet cautious. Ethan slowly raised his head, his expression vacant. He stood without resistance, raising his hands as if the weight of his guilt compelled him to surrender. "I'm the one you're looking for," he said, his voice low and devoid of emotion. "I did it." As the officers approached, they ordered him to his knees and cuffed his hands behind his back. Ethan complied without a word, staring straight ahead. His thoughts were a storm, yet his demeanor remained disturbingly calm. The flashbacks began as they led him to the squad car. Each step toward the vehicle brought memories of what his life once was, a kaleidoscope of love, laughter, and the quiet moments that now felt like another lifetime. He remembered the first time he met Laura, her radiant smile lighting up the room. He recalled their first home, a modest but cozy apartment in downtown Austin, where they spent countless nights dreaming about the future. But those memories gave way to darker ones. Ethan saw himself standing in the shadows of their living room, replaying Laura's hushed phone conversations with Jason in his head. He remembered the sting of betrayal as he listened to her laughter, a sound that once filled him with joy but now only deepened his despair. As the officers shut the car door, Ethan's gaze was drawn to the house, one last time. The sight of the driveway, now cordoned off with yellow crime scene tape, was burned into his memory. The lifeless bodies of Laura and Jason were barely visible under the careful coverings placed by first responders. Inside the car, Ethan rested his head against the cold window, his reflection staring back at him, a man he no longer recognized. He was transported to the police station in silence, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. The faint hum of the police radio was the only sound, a stark contrast to the chaos in his mind. At the station, Ethan's booking was methodical. Fingerprints, mugshots, and paperwork were completed as officers moved with practiced precision. Ethan remained silent, his compliance unnerving to those around him. When asked to recount what had happened, he spoke in a monotone voice, describing the events as if they had happened to someone else. "I followed them," he began, staring blankly at the table in front of him. "I saw them together. I confronted them. And then, I just couldn't take it anymore." His words were simple, yet the devastation behind them was profound. As he spoke, he avoided eye contact, his focus shifting inward. The room fell silent when he finished, the weight of his confession hanging heavy in the air. Back in the holding cell, Ethan sat on the edge of the cold metal bench. The distant sounds of the bustling station echoed faintly, but he barely noticed. His thoughts were consumed by the memories of what he had done and what he had lost. In his mind, Laura's voice echoed softly, her laughter mingling with images of Jason's smirk. He saw her standing in their kitchen, humming a tune he could no longer place, and Jason leaning casually against his car, a look of smug confidence etched on his face. Those images, once fuel for his rage, now brought an overwhelming wave of sorrow. Ethan thought about what might have been if he had chosen a different path. Could he have walked away? Could he have saved himself from the torment that now consumed him? But those questions had no answers. The finality of his actions was undeniable. As the hours passed, Ethan's calm exterior began to crack. Tears welled up in his eyes, spilling down his cheeks as he buried his face in his hands. The man who had once been a devoted husband and a respected member of his community was now a prisoner, both literally and figuratively, trapped by his own choices. The sound of an officer's voice announcing his arraignment for the next day brought him back to the present. Ethan nodded numbly, the reality of his future settling over him like a heavy shroud. There would be no redemption, no undoing what had been done. Ethan's journey from love to betrayal and ultimately to violence was complete. The man who had fought so hard to protect what he thought was his had destroyed it instead, leaving nothing but a trail of heartbreak and devastation in his wake. Ethan sat quietly in the courtroom, his hands clasped in front of him, the weight of the trial pressing heavily on his shoulders. The once loving husband now stood as the central figure in a case that gripped Austin and the nation. The media had labeled him a killer husband, plastering his face and the details of his crime across every news channel and tabloid. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with tension. Journalists and spectators crowded the gallery, eager to witness the conclusion of a tragic tale of love turned deadly. Ethan's calm demeanor during the proceedings had baffled everyone. Friends and neighbors who once knew him as a quiet, hard-working man couldn't reconcile the person in the dock with the one they had shared backyard barbecues and holiday greetings with. The prosecution painted Ethan as a man driven by obsession and control, arguing that his actions were premeditated. They highlighted his calculated steps, planting recording devices, installing a GPS tracker, and ultimately arming himself with a weapon. Ethan Carter chose violence, the prosecutor declared, and in doing so, he destroyed not only 2 lives, but also his own. The defense, while acknowledging Ethan's guilt, tried to humanize him. They brought in character witnesses, old co-workers, childhood friends, even a few neighbors who described Ethan as a kind and devoted man. They argued that his actions were the result of emotional torment and a mental breakdown caused by Laura's betrayal. This was not a cold-blooded killer, his lawyer pleaded. This was a man consumed by heartbreak and desperation. The jury deliberated for hours, and when they returned, the courtroom fell silent. Ethan showed no visible reaction as the verdict was read, guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, citing the calculated nature of his crime as grounds for the harsh penalty. As he was led out of the courtroom, Ethan caught a glimpse of Laura's parents sitting in the gallery. Their faces were etched with grief, not just for the loss of their daughter, but also for the man they had once welcomed into their family. Their presence was a reminder of the devastation that rippled outward from Ethan's actions, touching everyone who had known and loved Laura. Ethan's transfer to the penitentiary marked the beginning of a new and solitary chapter in his life. His days became a monotonous routine of prison meals, work assignments, and the occasional mandatory counseling session. Yet, in the midst of the grim surroundings, Ethan found himself haunted by memories of Laura. He spent hours alone in his cell, staring at a single photograph he had been allowed to keep, a picture of Laura from their honeymoon. She was smiling, carefree, standing on the shores of a sunlit beach. The image was a stark contrast to the darkness that now consumed Ethan's life. In those quiet moments, he reflected on everything that had led him to this point. He thought about the choices he had made, the rage he had let consume him, and the life he had thrown away. He wondered if Laura had ever truly loved him in those final months, or if their love had faded long before he had been willing to admit. Despite the bitterness that had once fueled his actions, Ethan's reflections were no longer driven by anger. Instead, he was filled with a deep sense of regret. He realized that, in his quest to punish Laura and Jason, he had ultimately destroyed himself. The life he had worked so hard to build was gone, replaced by an unrelenting loneliness. The media frenzy around the trial gradually died down, but the case left a lasting mark on Austin. It became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked emotions and the devastating consequences of betrayal. True crime enthusiasts continued to dissect the case, while locals recounted the story as a grim piece of Austin's history. Years passed, and Ethan became just another inmate among many. Yet, for him, each day in prison was a reminder of what he had lost. The walls of his cell felt like a tomb, enclosing him in a space where time moved forward, but his life remained frozen in the aftermath of his actions. One day, Ethan stood at the small window of his cell, gazing at the sliver of sky visible beyond the bars. He whispered Laura's name softly, as if speaking it into the void could bring her back. But there was no answer, only the cold, unyielding silence of his new reality. Ethan's story ended not with redemption or peace, but with the quiet acknowledgement of his failures. He remained a man defined by his choices, locked away not only by the prison walls, but by the memories of a love that had once been his entire world.